Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm the lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace. And today, as we come together and celebrate, we're walking into a brand new conversation called Thriving in Transition. The reality is that every single one of us is in the midst of transition. We're transitioning to work from home. We're transitioning to homeschool, or I guess we call it distance learning now. I don't know what that is. But all of us, for some of us, we're transitioning out of a job. For some of us, we're transitioning into a job. And the reality is that life is full of transitions. But right now, that seems to be amplified. And transitions are, well, they're tricky, aren't they? They're tricky. And if we're not careful with transitions, oftentimes we can actually walk out of transitions in a place where we never wanted to be. Maybe even a place we never thought we would be. If we don't pay attention to a key principle that we need to understand about transitions. It's crucial that we understand this, because as we move through transitions, what happens is life gets really busy. It's more busy than our routine. We're having to add all these different things because we're in the midst of two things at the same time, and as we move between them, what happens is we become very focused on the activity. We start to focus in on the activity of life and what we need to get done and what needs to be where. And as we focus on what's happening out here, oftentimes we can forget to pay attention to what's happening in here. We talked about this a couple weeks ago when we talked about the reality that peace is found in God's presence, and that oftentimes in the midst of hurt, we get busy. The same thing happens with transitions. We start to get busy, and we're focusing on the activity. And as we're focusing on the activity, we ignore this key principle. We ignore the reality that habits aren't formed after a transition. Habits are actually formed in the midst of transition. It's so important, because as we're moving through the activity of transition, what we'll say to ourselves is this: we'll say, well, you know what? When I get to the end of this, then I'm going to establish. You know what? When I get through this, then I'm going to establish. When I'm finally set up, then I'm going to. And we think, okay, well, we'll worry about that once we get everything in place. Which is why oftentimes we come out of transitions in a place we never intended to be. Sometimes I experience this with people who are starting new jobs, and they'll say, well, you know, at the beginning I'm going to have to work really, really hard and long hours, but then it's going to change. But then, and here's the thing about this: the then, it never comes. It never comes. Because, well, no, you've established, as you move through that transition, what you do is you establish the habit. You establish the expectation. What you're doing, you don't build your life after transition. You actually build it in the midst of transition. The habits established in the transition are in fact the habits of the future. Which is why I want to be able to take time right now, because not only are we in transition, but we're going to be in transition as we move through the summer and into the fall. Okay, what is life going to look like? And I want to make sure as we move through this transition that we thrive. Because while transitions are tricky, they also present us with a phenomenal opportunity. And what I want to make sure of is that as we move through this, that we're able to actually continue finding our way back to God, that we're able to leverage the transition to our advantage, as opposed to it being something that works against us. In order to do that, what I want to do is I want to take you to the story of an individual who found himself in the midst of a massive transition. I think that when you look at Scripture, there's a story that gives us a great example of someone who paid attention to habit in the midst of transition. His name was Daniel. We find his story in the Jewish Scriptures, and I want to take you there. There's actually an entire book that tells you about his story. He was a phenomenal individual that pursued God in really powerful ways, and God used him in unbelievable ways. But as we pick up the story, I actually want to begin as he's in the midst of one of the biggest transitions of his life. It's actually a moment of loss if you go back to our previous conversation, because as we pick up the story, you see Nebuchadnezzar has conquered the nation of Israel. And not only has he conquered and taken whatever he wanted, but he's also taken with him captives. One of those captives is Daniel. So we're gonna pick up the story as Daniel is being taken from his homeland and really being made a prisoner in this foreign country. Listen to what it says. It says, the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family. Now notice this. This is important because this helps you to understand who Daniel was. Daniel was not just anybody. Daniel was actually part of the royal family. And when Nebuchadnezzar had conquered the nation of Israel and conquered Jerusalem, he had taken the royal family and he had made them his slaves. And so he says, I want for you to take some of the men of the royal family and other noble families who have been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all of them from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names, and this is where Daniel gets his Babylonian name. Daniel was called Belshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. And there's 2 reasons why this food would have been unacceptable. It had to do with the fact that oftentimes it was offered to idols before it was actually presented to these young men. And God had strictly instructed the nation of Israel, listen, don't eat food that has been offered to idols. And so as he steps in, he says, no, and in addition to that, they also ate things that inside of the Jewish law, Daniel was not permitted to eat. And so as he's in the midst of this transition, it's amazing because he's presented with this situation. And Daniel, listen to what it says. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. And Daniel says, listen, we can't eat this. And the guy in charge actually seems to like Daniel, but as he's in the midst of this conversation, he says, listen, I don't make the orders here. I'm not the one who gets to decide this, and I'm afraid if I disobey, it will literally be the end of me. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then listen to what Daniel does. This is incredibly wise. He says, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food, which is really interesting because Daniel says, listen, let's put this to a test. In a lot of ways, he's saying, okay, God, I want to follow you, and I want to step into this with you. I want to prioritize you. I want to worship you. I want to serve you in this. But God, I need your help as we move through this, because it's only God that's able to do what happens. Daniel said, at the end of 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. Now, let me be super clear about this. Super clear about this. This is very important. This is the only acceptable reason to ever become a vegetarian. Ever. The only reason is if there's no other choice. No other choice. No, I'm kidding. I love vegetarians. They eat everything I don't want to eat so I can eat more of what I do want to eat. At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only fruit and vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom, and God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. Daniel finds himself in the midst of this insane transition. I mean, think about it. Think about what he's lost. Think about what he's been taken from. And in the midst of this transition, he decides to focus, not just on the activity of what's happening, but he decides to focus on who he's becoming, who he is. And when it comes to, and we're going to see as we move through the life of Daniel, that this is not just one habit that he establishes. Habits were very important to Daniel and a big part of his life. But when it comes to this, he decides, no. When it comes to what it is that I'm going to eat, I'm going to establish this now. It could have been so easy. Listen. It could have been so easy for Daniel to say, you know what? Once we get set, then we can worry about that. Like once we get settled, I mean, let's wait until we've kind of worked our way up a little bit, and then we can make an issue out of this. Once we get, it could have been really easy for him to think, okay, no, we'll worry about that habit later. We'll put that off. And this is something that all of us do. I experience it this way. So many times I'll talk to people who are coming into Hoboken Grace, and sometimes they'll say to me, you know, I used to go to church, and then they'll say this. They'll say, and then I moved to Hoboken, and I don't know what happened, and it's been like 2 years, and I thought, well, I should get back into church. Some of you listening right now, that was your story. And in the midst of the transition, because one of those important transitions is a move. In the midst of transition, you don't prioritize the habit. And when you don't prioritize the habit, you develop a new habit. And all of a sudden, one day, you wake up 2 years later and you're like, what happened? Listen, when you don't prioritize the habit, you're developing a new habit. And often in the midst of transition, this is what happens. And we find ourselves living a life that we didn't really intend to live, but it's just the result of that transition. It happens in so many different ways in our lives. Habits aren't established after the transition. They're established during the transition. And this can be so overwhelming because of the fact that transitions are so busy. And we talk about there's just so much activity. And that's true, which is why when you're going through a transition, it's important, don't add. Don't add. Like I've been talking to our leaders about this in certain situations and circumstances, just saying, listen, you need to understand something. As you're going through this, you need to understand that even though you look at your life and say, wait a second, I'm just staying at home. It seems like there's less to do than what there was before. Why is it that I'm more tired than I was before? It, it's not just the activity of transition that adds to life. It's what you have to process and everything that's going on mentally. And when you're in routine, you don't have to think through everything. When you move through transition, you do. And so it's true that you don't want to add, but you need to make sure, all of us, we need to make sure that we focus, even though we're not adding, that we focus on the foundation. Focus on the foundation. Those habits are so incredibly important. And as Daniel moved through that transition, he decided, no, I'm going to focus on the foundation. I'm not going to compromise with the foundation as I move through this transition. No, I'm going to focus in on this and make sure that as I come out of this, that foundation is established, that foundation is solid. And here's the good news. Here's the good news. Transition gives you the best opportunity to do that. Transition gives you the best opportunity to be able to adjust those habits, to change those habits. And here's what I know about you. For many of us, we have worked for years to change habits. And when you're in the midst of routine, it's very difficult to change habits. But when you move through transition, it becomes easier. And many of us, we have habits that we want to transition out of, or habits that we want to add. And so we don't want to eat out as much as we used to, or we want to eat at home more, or you want to stop listening to Taylor Swift, which is just a good idea. There's so many different things that you want to transition into or out of. And here's what I want for us to capture. And this is what we mean by this idea of thriving in transition. This is the chance to do it. Listen to me. This is the chance to do it. And I know that as we're walking through this, that a lot of what we're up against, it's overwhelming, but I want for you to be able to see that there's something really powerful that we can grab hold of as we move through this. But here's the thing. You're not going to rebuild your life later. It happens right now. It's built in the midst. Habits are not established after the transition. They're established during the transition. This is why when you look at those major changing points in your life, they're almost always connected to a transition. And so when you started college, or when you switched jobs, or when you moved to that new place, it's not the circumstances. It's not the circumstances that changed the habit. It's the fact that transition gives you a unique opportunity to let go of the old routine and to rebuild a new one. And what we want to do as we move through this is to make sure that we take advantage of that. I mean, just think about it in your own life now. Think about the habits that you first established when we went into quarantine. How many of those have changed? How different is your life today than the first 2 weeks of then? At the beginning, you established when you were going to wake up. And some of you are really excited because you've always wanted to be a morning person, and now you are a morning person because morning starts at noon. And you're like, finally, I've made it. And no one knows, so no one can tell you otherwise. It's been a great experience for you. But here's the thing. Whatever you established then, I'm willing to bet you're still doing now. In the transition into quarantine, what you did is you established habits. And those habits, well, once you establish routine, it's difficult to change them, isn't it? Which is why some of you are personally keeping Domino's in business. Because early on, you established, no, I'm just going to order out. I'm just going to, and now you're like, wow, I hear other people talking about how their expenses have decreased, and my expenses, they've increased. What's happening? But what you establish in transition, well, that's what you're going to live with. And what I want to make sure of is that as we move through this, that we take advantage of it, that we can thrive in transition so that as we come out of transition, we have a routine that we know God is calling us to, a routine that is moving us towards God instead of away from God. And so here's what I want for you to do. Here's your homework for this week. And yes, as we move through this conversation, I'm going to give you homework throughout the entire conversation because this is super practical. We're going to get super practical because this is not just an idea that we need to know. This is something that we need to begin to practice. Because you don't know when the transition is going to come, when it's going to end. So you have to make sure as you're moving through it that you begin now. So let me ask you, what do you want your life to look like when you come out of this? I just thought of something right there, and I know that was a really serious question, so I don't want to take away from it, but I just thought of the fact that sometimes I pause like that, and many of you right now are like checking to see if the feed was buffering. I'm sorry that I do that. It's just the way that I usually speak, and people are freaking out everywhere. But again, let me go back to what we were talking about. What do you want for your life to look like when you come out of this? What are the habits that you want to establish? For some of you, as you moved into quarantine, you actually established some habits that you don't want to lose. Some of you have run more in the last 2 months than the rest of your life put together. Because you can run anytime you want. And obviously, the circumstances are going to change. But what is it that you want your life to look like? And don't think circumstance, think you. What do you want? What are the habits you want to establish in terms of health? And don't think for 1 second that our physical health doesn't impact our relationship with God. Jesus says, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and what? Strength. What is it that you want your health habits to look like? What about your pursuit of God? As we move through this series, we're going to introduce something I'm really excited about when it comes to our personal experience, pursuit of God, in connection with our rhythms. What do you want? What do you want that to look like? In terms of relationship, what do you want that to look like? In terms of how you manage your finances, what do you want that to look like? What is it? What are the habits that you want to establish? Maybe some of which you have tried to establish for years, and you've thought there's no way I'm ever going to be successful at it. Right now is your best chance. It's your best opportunity. What do you want to establish? And my homework to you is this. I want you to actually write it down. Write it down somewhere that you can come back to it every week as we walk through this conversation together. Because we don't want to just talk about thriving in transition. We want to actually thrive in transition. And we're going to see how Daniel, his establishment of habits, it didn't just shape a moment for him, it shaped the rest of his life. And it began right here as he decided in the midst of that transition, no, I'm not going to wait till later. Right now, I'm going to work on who I am and who I'm becoming. Because he knew, you don't build it later, you build it now. And it's my prayer that would be our story as we move through this moment. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you for the incredible example of Daniel and how, not just in the story that we read today, but how he established these habits that allowed him to be able to thrive. And I just pray that as we move through this transition, I pray that we would recognize this principle. I pray that we would understand how crucial it is. I pray that we wouldn't become a victim of transition, but that we would seize that opportunity, we'd seize this moment, in order to take one more step, a few more steps towards what it means to be like your Son, towards what it means to pursue you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. I pray that you'd help us to reflect you better so that we could continue to share with the world around us, so that we could better share with the world around us the truth of how you love them. In Jesus' name, amen.